God, you know what? I really, really do not want to have to make this kind of video. Just, just really not what I want to be doing with my time, but here we are again. Okay, we're back at it again. Britain is experiencing a racism-related crisis triggered by opportunism, and I'm gonna be real with you all. I'm tired of it. It's year in, year out, and each year the response is more toothless. Just as a heads up, this video is not going to be pleasant, even by my usual standards, because I'm fucking tired. Like I said. Also, the instigating incident is something that's really quite heartbreaking, and seeing it be exploited by opportunists against the wishes of the victim's family is in itself quite upsetting. For those of you unaware, on December 3rd, a student in Southampton called Henry Novak was stabbed and died of those wounds after police handcuffed him and failed to check on his wounds after he'd called out multiple times that he'd been stabbed and couldn't breathe. The body cam footage is out there, and I don't recommend you watch it. I did it because I felt like I needed to in order to write this script, but it's not pleasant for reasons that I hope are obvious, and frankly, I'm probably still a little bit upset about it as I record this, and upset about a bunch of other things. It's also very clear that insofar as medical intervention could have helped, the police are definitely significantly to blame for his death. The person who did this stabbing was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, and in a normal society this would have been the end of it, at least for those of us who didn't know Henry Novak. Obviously for his family and for friends, this is an unimaginable loss, but for the rest of us, once the killer was put behind bars, that should more or less have been the end of it in terms of commentary, and we should allow the family to grieve in peace. That's the point of having a justice system, but because this is Britain, we can't be normal about this, especially when the killer is from a minority group, as the killer was, since he was a Sikh man, which of course meant that a series of interventions ranging from the just kind of factually detached, such as those that are calling for a ban on Sikhs carrying ceremonial knives, when that wasn't the knife that was used in the murder, all the way to what can only be described as calls for racist violence, with one particular standout being Nigel Farage's call for the British public to respond with pure cold rage, to which some segments of the British public seemed to respond in Southampton, where people engaged in a riot answering this call for pure cold rage. This is actually, and perhaps somewhat ironically, an example of not just two-tier policing, but a two-tier society, which will be something we swing back to, I'm sure. I just want to make a particular and important point that's going under the radar a little, which is that what Nigel Farage appears to have done is incite violence. He even doubled down on the pure cold rage line and said that the division will get far worse, which I agree with, actually, as a prediction, but it will get worse because of people like him and his goon Matt Goodwin, who gets to go on TV and make interventions that go fundamentally unchallenged. So all of what Nigel Farage has done seems illegal, actually. And again, put a pin in it, because I think we're going to be coming back to that. But the fact that he hasn't even had the police at his door for inciting violence does seem like there's some kind of two-tier policing going on, to say nothing of the Labour Party's piss-weak response to this, compared to the tough guy act they put on when they're arresting your nan who's opposed to genocide. All of this fits into a repeating and escalating pattern where every summer the far right and their electoral vehicles find an excuse to get out into the streets and do something. Whether it's hanging flags from lampposts and painting them on roundabouts, which, while intended to intimidate, did kind of come off as really fragile and pathetic, but that's kind of the core character of the far right anyway. The astute among you will notice that between October and April, we don't really get this as much. Like, there aren't, like, attempted pogroms in November very often. And vandalism sprees they don't really happen in December nights. And one might look at the weather in the UK and draw some conclusions about why that is. But that's not really why this keeps happening over and over again. It's not just that the sun comes out and people go, you know what, it's time to get really racist. The real reason is that repeatedly the government, senior politicians, and the press keep validating the framing that these people use. Whether that's articles where they just say the thing that the far right are saying, or Keir Starmer, who has come out to condemn this, basically boiling his opposition down to, they're right, but they shouldn't express it this way. Because the Starmer and his project, the correct way to do racist violence is with the force of the state, instead of a bunch of pissed up dickheads in the streets. His opposition is also made weaker and, a bit more pointless by things like his repetition of Great Replacement theory and his Island of Strangers speech. It's not solely his fault. For once, I'm going to cut Starmer a little bit of slack here. The path has been long and winding, but he's certainly found ways to pour fuel onto the fire, and as the old expression goes, a fish rots from the head down. These latest incidents, and I'm recording on the Friday night, so there may have been some since, there may even be some happening right now, but as of recording, these latest incidents have triggered a series of people claiming that what it's really about is two-tier policing, which I want to be upfront about and say is bullshit. I'll explain why in a second, but I want you to know, before we do this exercise, that the version of two-tier policing being centered in the media discourses and the political response is nonsense. I'm going to keep saying it as many times as I need to say it. Now, there are some people who will say talking about this in this way is not helpful, it's disrespectful, and that there are some underlying legitimate concerns, to which I'd say, I already did a video about legitimate concerns, so, not buying it. But I want to make the point that if you are someone who believes in this or who thinks that this is an attitude to be coddled, that it's less respectful to allow someone to be wrong for the sake of maybe convincing them to, vote for you or something. If you want to show people the respect they deserve, you need to tell them they're wrong. It's a far-right fantasy, but I want us to walk through the concept abstractly, and you'll see why I want to do this, because we can see a recurring far-right tendency and what the real purpose of this being pushed might be. In this theory of how policing works, the premise is that the police treat different communities and people in different ways that are unfair and undermine trust in policing, the rule of law, equality before the law, these kinds of things. Purely in the abstract, you notice two things. One is that it's the classic appropriation of rhetoric we associate with the left. This notion that certain communities are over-policed and underprotected is a point that a lot of people associated with the left make when critiquing police. The other is that it's hitting upon something that's kind of true in specific cases and in terms of most people's experience with the police. The specific argument, however, isn't that the police are a force to protect capital or often cause more harm than good by their mere presence, or that these communities that are over-policed are often ones that contain a significant number of minorities or are heavily deprived, and I will note that there tends to be quite a bit of overlap between those two categories. Instead, the argument goes that some pervasive anti-white racism has taken over. Now, I need to be very clear when I say this. Anti-white racism doesn't exist in Britain. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. There's a whole other video to be done about why white British people seem to really want to be oppressed on that basis, but that point needs to be made. It's not real. In this specific case, I'm being told that the police would have treated Henry Novak better if he was visibly a minority of some kind. And I'm just not really seeing how I'm supposed to think that would be the case. I want to be very just sort of honest about what this is now. The main motivation behind the violence in response to this case is not some high-minded appeal to equality before the law, but is just some people who are racist and want to kick the shit out of someone. That's it. But the reason the two-tier policing line takes hold is because the police are fucking useless. For once, I'm going to refer to Britain's largest forehead, Brendan O'Neill, and not show you an actual picture of his forehead, because the caricature in the article does a good enough job. He put out an article in the far-right Spectator magazine that drew a direct comparison between the murder of George Floyd and Henry Novak, asking why raging about one was okay, but not the other. There are people even taking the knee for Henry Novak, and look, people can express themselves peacefully how they like, but come on, aren't you even a little embarrassed to be doing this? Like, how do you look at this and not think this is the most embarrassing thing you've ever seen? The thing about that is, I think you can be angry about both, and both have their failures in institutional cultures. It's just that you can see what this comparison is for, and can you blame people for looking at it and going, you're being a bit of a dickhead for drawing this comparison? If the right had come out and said, hey, this is another example of the police being useless because they don't fulfill the role that people think they should in society, and they'd not leaned into the anti-white racism angle or tried to create their own martyr purely for the purposes of telling minorities to shut up forever, then maybe we could have had a conversation, because anyone who's had to interact with the police can tell you they're just fucking useless. I can't find another way to describe them. They don't protect anyone, they don't do anything about crime, and their presence doesn't help in most situations. I don't get why political parties are obsessed with police being on the streets. I don't want to fucking see them. These things don't happen because they're standing around consulting their sensitivity training on their phone or whatever, but because there's a culture of contempt for the general public. If you don't believe me, do one thing. Ask any woman in your life who's had to call the police because of harassment. Ask anyone who's been burgled. Ask anyone who's gone through a mental health crisis that's required some form of intervention. And they can tell you exactly how bad the police are. It's not like it's some great secret that the police are terrible at fulfilling the role people think they should. And that's probably why an obvious fantasy like two-tier policing can take hold among some people. Part of the reason, and one of the ways we can see that it's taken hold, is in the press coverage. There have always been sections of the British press who have been open about associating with and laundering far-right views. The Spectator is the classic example. So is the Daily Mail, and there have always been individual journalists who have been open fascists in the British press, or have expressed views that sail very close to the wind in that regard. Some people have expressed shock at the BBC and Sky News reporting on this, where they have just repeated the far-right frame. And I'm not going to do the smug sort of they were always like that response, because it's just kind of not the point. And also, they kind of weren't. Not too long ago, they were at least able to identify a dog whistle. So were a lot of the press. And if you know me or this channel, you'll know that I have a very low opinion of the competence and quality of British journalism. So if I'm telling you there's been a collapse in standards, it's gotten really bad. Years of insisting, and I would say cynically and for political purposes, that Britain is one of the most tolerant countries in the world and that there is no institutional racism, while loudly taking any opportunity to brand the left and minorities as the real racists, has marched us down this path where significant sections of the press, and subsequently our political class, because they are very much intertwined with each other, concede to different degrees to the far-right position. I find it hard to believe that if there was a big crying session about anti-white racism, that it would simply be repeated without challenge in as many outlets as it has been this time, and that a serial loser like Matt Goodwin would be allowed to come onto the BBC and say this pretty much unchallenged. Something has very clearly gone awry here. When you sit down and look at the political media response alongside the typical police response to a lot of incidents, you can clearly see that there is some kind of tiered response depending on who a victim or a perpetrator is. The problem is it's not the non-existent anti-white racism that's driving it, but something else. and something that I would argue is both real and more sinister. The organizing principle, I would say, is at play here is what I would call a hierarchy of racism, which, despite the name, does also have a sort of political component to it as well. It's not just about race, it's about politics as well. It's a whole thing, and it's not really the direct subject of this, but it's how I'd describe it. For example, if we take the reaction to Novak's death and compare it to, say, this story about a Saudi student being stabbed and the person who did it getting sentenced, there weren't sudden outcries, even from the left, of there being some kind of virulent anti-Arab or Islamophobic issue, despite there being some parallels at play, including a parent attempting to help the perpetrator. This isn't even reported as national news, and part of that is that the hijacking of the tragedy around Novak did make it national news, but it's interesting what gets hijacked and what doesn't, and why, and what gets put on the front page of the BBC and what doesn't. People were able to let this be a local story, to let the justice system play out, and setting aside my visceral disgust at the people's hijacking of Novak's death, which I hope you share, it's easy to see why, and it's because white people can't act like precious little baby victims about this one. There is an irony about the British far-right behaving this way over a person with an Eastern European surname when they were all screaming about Polish people coming in the 2000s. More evidence for the whiteness is bullshit pile, I suppose. To keep it specifically focused on policing for just a little bit, and not on the wider atmosphere, if you want to see what preferential policing looks like, I would point to the relative kids' gloves used whenever there are these far-right agitators on the streets versus the immediate use of anti-terror powers against pensioners who are opposed to genocide. I'll grant you this, arresting a pensioner is lower risk than dealing with a coked up dickhead who's throwing a wheelie bin at you. It's just that one is more obviously an immediate threat than the other, and what we see is relatively gentle treatment. Now, I could revert to the old joke about it being hard for the police to arrest their off-duty colleagues whenever the far-right appear. This joke sort of resurfaces, but it does start to look like some kind of radicalization has taken hold after the 100th fucking time we see these people out trying to burn hotels or whatever it is that they like to do on their weekends instead of spending time wondering why their kids never call. If it's not radicalization, then it's pretty clear the police have just become more political in this country. The fact that Farage can seemingly waltz around this country inciting violence and predicting more violence that will be instigated by him and his party without any kind of direct censure from the police and the mildest criticism from the wettest hand we've ever had as Prime Minister doesn't bode well. But a left-wing political leader can be subjected to a direct political intervention for the crime of criticizing the police. Now, I'm not going to get into what was said in specific terms because Zack Polanski, who's the politician I'm talking about, has, in my view, incorrectly walked back those comments and apologized. But Democratic politicians are either allowed to criticize the police or we need to drop the Democratic pretense. In my view, the head of the Met should probably have been sacked for that, and subsequent interventions that he made. But it's really interesting what the police can do politically and in the political sphere, and when they choose to deploy it. Policing in this country and as a concept is fucked. And that's why I'm very much on the abolition side of that debate. It's especially bad now that elite radicalization seems to have taken hold in all areas of our politics. There's now a drive to say that considerations around race has gone too far in the police, all while we know that there are still underprotected and over-policed communities, which is exacerbated by the politicization of minorities in this country. I don't want to get into the specifics, but there are plenty of stories on social media you can look at about how the police conduct themselves. in all sorts of situations, ranging from how they police protests to how they handle muggings, all sorts of things. They're not helpful at all. But it's not because they're anti-white racists. There's no credible pattern of behavior that points to this non-existent thing being the problem. It would be odd if it was, because the police are often whiter than the communities they police in the UK. The fact that we even have to address this speaks to how much elite radicalization has taken hold and trickled down. I hate to be a downer in these videos, but my fear is that it's going to get worse before it gets better, especially because this is being driven by a right who are aware that the sands have shifted beneath them and can't really make sense of what to do other than embrace their worst elements. I mean, they're all bad, but you get what I mean. You have my express permission, though, if someone does try to tell you that the police are anti-white racist or that there's two-tier policing, to tell them to shut the fuck up. It's really that simple. Alright, we're back. Schedule's a bit messed up on the channel because I was away on a stag do and I will be away for a wedding. So things are a bit messed up schedule-wise, but I'm trying to get back on track a little bit. But I need to thank my proofreader who read this on the night I recorded it. Thank you to them. I also need to say, if you like the video, like, comment, subscribe, all of the good stuff. And if you really like it, join the Patreon, join the YouTube members program, and you might be able to get a shout out like these top tier patrons: Drone Riff, Kersley Scheider, Liron, Jar Jar Muba, and Carolyn, and the YouTube members Nadir Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Ben Johnson. Thank you to them, and thank you for making it this far into the video. I will be trying to get back onto a regular schedule, as I said, but I need to go away and do that. Not right now as I'm recording this, but I will be trying my best to get back to the 2 videos a month that I usually do, weddings and stag do's permitting, of course. And on that note, everyone, I will catch you all in the next one. See ya!